Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar brought to you by Grow and Lead Community and Youth Development. Tonight's topic is board and staff relationships. Before we get into it, though, we'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are at Grow and Lead. We're a nonprofit organization, and we help communities throughout the UP, and we want them to be greater places for kids to grow up. We believe that communities need to foster a culture that builds into the strength of the young people to be sustainable. We believe that nonprofits and an effective nonprofit sector helps provide what youth need to thrive, and it's critical for community progress. We do that by an array of ways, mostly through training, consulting, facilitation, and many of you that are even on this webinar tonight are probably members of Grow and Lead. And so if you're interested in finding out all the benefits of being a member with Grow and Lead, you can check out our website at glcyd.org for all that information. We also have, this is actually our kind of our board development or board focus month in January. And so we've had webinars every Wednesday night this month. And we have one more coming up next week, which is strategic planning. So January 30th, again, at the same time, 6 p.m. So you can sign up again on our website. And there is a survey that'll follow this webinar that we really strongly encourage you to fill out, and especially drop us some ideas on topics you might like to see in the future, so we can develop some webinars that provide the information and knowledge that you need to be more successful within your organization. So tonight's training objectives, we want to understand the general roles of board members, volunteers, chief executives, and their staff, and then we'll discuss the relationships between board, volunteers, and staff. And now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's presenter. She is my boss, the CEO of Grow and Lead, Amy Quinn. So Amy, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Chad. There is so much that could be said on this topic, and I'm sure you all have many stories of things that have gone awry, possibly. It was difficult to decide what to include in this webinar, so tonight's going to be a broad, basic overview, and then I'll try to leave time for questions. That way, I think that's kind of a perk of tuning into a webinar live, so to speak, is to be able to ask questions. So I'm not going to make any promises, but I will try to do that. And what you see here, we're just starting out with, this is kind of a stereotypical organizational chart for a nonprofit, for a smaller nonprofit. And then, of course, we want to recognize and account for our cadre of volunteers, because there's no way we could do what we do on the budgets that we're given without volunteers. And if you think about it, even your own organization, this is probably where you started. A group of volunteers come together and they want to provide service. They're passionate about a certain cause. And so they form a board, which is the formal entity for the organization. And there's also non-board member volunteers as well. It's okay to stay this way. We know several organizations that are all volunteer organizations, and they have a board, and then they also have non-board member volunteers. And the board and volunteers do a lot of the duties that staff normally would. So they are the board's governing the organization and putting on a staff hat and a volunteer hat. So they're wearing 3 hats, which we'll talk about a little later. And if you've listened to any of our board webinars, you have probably heard about the 3 hats. And it is okay to stay this way. You have your own processes in place. You have your communication down. Hopefully, as new people come along, you train them and you have policies and procedures in place for that long-term sustainability. But then some organizations, maybe there's a turnover in volunteers, maybe there's an opportunity to expand services. For whatever reason, the organization is at a point where the board says, you know what, we need to hire someone because it's getting too much for us in the way that we want to handle, and our vision is a lot bigger than just us as volunteers. So you have your first paid staff, and it can be full-time or part-time. It doesn't matter. It's whatever works for the organization. And the key is you start to divide up your duties. And here are some examples of what a board might do as a group, and then what the CEO would do, or the paid staff. And I use the term CEO just because it's the chief executive. You could be called an executive director, you could be called a program director, a chief operating officer. It's whoever is the paid staff person that manages the organization. But throughout this webinar, I will call it CEO. And again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. And if you want more data or more information, again, tune into our Board 101, and you'll see a slide like this that talks about the division of responsibilities. But the key is that you make sure and you do divide those responsibilities, who's going to do what, and that it's communicated not only amongst the board and the paid staff, but also with the volunteers as well. So I'm going to give you a little scenario, and we're going to talk through that to show examples of how these transitions can happen. So let's say that there's Johnny, and Johnny is a board member for a relief organization, and we'll call it Purple Cross. Now keep in mind, all of my stories are made up. There's no Purple Cross that I know of. This is not indicative of any one single organization. So I want to make sure and put that out there, that this is all made up by Amy Quinn. But Johnny serves on the board of Purple Cross, and he has been on the board for 5 years since they founded it, and he's a proud board member. And he's also excited that last year they got to the point where they needed to hire paid staff, and they're expanding their services and everything. So he's a great ambassador for Purple Cross. Every activity he goes to, or anyone he's talking to, he talks about the latest relief efforts that they are doing. And one day he runs across Susie, who's an artist. And Susie was saying, oh, you know what? I have been wanting to do a special father-daughter art event. And I want it to be where there's different stations, so there's different types of art, and they're not limited by what they can or can't do, but it's just a time for fathers and daughters to come together and to bond and to have fun and to do art projects, and we'll design them intentionally so that it will help build communication between the fathers and daughters. And the more Susie talked about this day of art, the more Johnny got excited about it, and he thought it was a great idea. And he said, I'll tell you what, Susie, he said, at Purple Cross, we have a really nice conference room that would be perfect for your art day. So if you're looking for a place to do it, you just call our CEO and let him know that I said you could use that room, and tell him you're using it for a father-daughter art project. Time out. Dun, dun, dun. There's a foul on the play. Someone needs to throw a flag. Uh-oh, what went wrong? Hopefully, you can identify kind of the misstep, I guess you could say, in that scenario. And obviously, it was that Johnny promised something as a board member that he had no authority or right to be able to promise. A board member, as an individual, inherently has no authority or rights to the organization. The board only has authority when they are in a quorum, in a meeting, working as a group or a unit. And so one reason why this happened is, even though you have a paid staff, they have a paid staff now at Purple Cross, Johnny forgot that he can no longer just offer up resources from Purple Cross, because he's no longer a working volunteer, or he no longer has that hat to be able to give that authority. And so during this time, and this can be a long transition, depending on how long the board members have been around and whatnot, but at some point, the board needs to make sure that they release individual authority, that they release operations, that they release day-to-day things and decision-making on the day-to-day things to the paid staff. That's why they have a paid staff. And you also need to make sure and communicate that to volunteers, because I've heard scenarios where a volunteer, or excuse me, a board member has gone to a volunteer and said, will you pull this report for me? Well, the volunteers need to know that the CEO is now the person of authority. The board and the CEO need to emphasize this at every step of the game. So if a board member were to go to this employee and say, I want to report for XYZ, then the employee should say, you know, did you talk to the CEO about this? Or does the CEO know that I need to do this or whatnot? Ideally, you would want the communications to go through the CEO, because then the CEO would know what's being asked of their staff or their volunteers, and if it makes sense for that certain staff person or that certain volunteer to actually handle the task for that board member. So bottom line is, once you have a paid staff person, you as a board and as a volunteer, you now have, I guess you could say, you have a boss. The organization has its chief executive. And it's an interesting dynamic, because while technically the board is the boss of the CEO, that's only when the board is wearing their governance hat. And when the board is as an individual is volunteering with the organization, then the CEO is the board members, that individual board members volunteer, is the CEO is their boss. So you definitely need trust, and you definitely need open communication. And what I'm going to do tonight is hopefully give you some tips for the transitions, and to help equip you have some discussions around this if you're having too much of that tension. And so tips for transitions, we've already talked about: have a clear job description and expectations for the CEO. And if you decide to hire not a CEO, but you have a paid staff and you just need them to be clerical, then make that clear to that person and to the board and to all volunteers, that this is what is expected of this person. They will coordinate meetings, they will buy office supplies, they are not to make decisions on any purchase over, let's say, $100. They're not on any single item. They aren't to make policies or decisions on behalf of the organization. That's still all up to the board. That's if you were to hire a part-time clerical person or coordinator to help with more of the administrative clerical duties. That's not what we're talking about tonight. What we're talking about is the board has hired someone that they see to be the leader of the organization from a staffing standpoint. And so you want to make sure and delineate, because each organization is different. We can give you, at Grow and Lead, we can give you some ideas of what board members do versus what staff would do, and what the board's in charge of versus staff. But every once in a while, I come across an organization that they don't do it that way, and it works for them. So I think the key is that you have clear communications and that everyone's on the same page. Otherwise, that's when you get the foul plays and you need to throw the flags. So board members, I keep talking about these hats. Board members have 3 different hats. One, your governing hat, and that's when you're in the boardroom with a quorum, you're performing your governance duties. Then you have an implementation hat, and that's you have limited authority granted to you by the board depending on what it may be like for a committee. So it depends for a specific task. The majority of the time that you're a board member for an organization, you're actually a volunteer. And so you should view yourself as a volunteer, and you should view your new paid staff person as the boss, even though you probably, especially when the person first starts, you probably know more about the organization than they do. So it's an interesting dynamic, but it's one that you're really going to need to work through on behalf of all your clients. Otherwise, all of you, the board and the staff and the volunteers, will be in this cycle of chaos and not able to serve as many customers as you would, because you're having to deal with all these miscommunications and these little fires that come up, so to speak. So communicate the changes, reinforce the new organization chart, help people understand that if a volunteer comes to you as a board member and asks you a question, that like, when are we going to get a new copier? This copier keeps breaking down. I'm sick of it. The board member should say, that's not my decision to make. We approved office supplies in the budget, and it's been proved, or we granted the money in the budget, and the CEO, that's up to the CEO to make the decision on what to buy and when. And so deflecting and say, you need to talk to the CEO can really help reduce all of that chaos that could happen. One of the biggest things I can encourage you to do is to expect, to anticipate, and to recognize there will be growing pains. You're growing as an organization, and then just like an organization is made up of people, and people aren't perfect. And if you think about it, it's a lot like a relationship. The board and the CEO, that first paid staff, it's a lot like a marriage or a significant relationship where you're continually needing to check with each other, talk to each other, make sure you're on the same page, and know that there's going to be things that you're going to have to work through. And so remember that you're all on the same team, and you want to create a culture that helps foster that open discussion. So now that we think back to Johnny, the board member that said Susie, the artist, could use Purple Cross's conference room, what could or should Johnny have done? And I know this is a webinar and you're on mute, so I don't expect you to answer out loud, or I don't expect to hear your answer. But my answer would be Johnny should have said, you know, we have a big conference room, and I'm not sure if we allow other people to use it or not. I don't know what our policies are on that, but we just hired a CEO and he knows the drill, so contact him and see if that's something that may be available. That way he's not promising anything, but he is offering it as a potential solution. Johnny could have also talked to the CEO and asked the CEO to contact Susie about this. Although if you think about it, I also intentionally created the project that's going to happen be an art project focused on father and daughters, whereas the agency is a relief agency, the Purple Cross. So this art project doesn't really fit into their mission, or it's definitely not spot on target to their mission. And so here again, the CEO would need to think about, do we want to do this and then also the CEO needs to think about, do we have policies in place for other organizations to use our conference room? Are there certain hours that they can use it? Is there a fee? What happens if something breaks? You know, do you have an agreement, like a usage agreement or whatnot? So the CEO needs to think through some things too. And I also threw in there what could or should Susie have done. And in Susie's defense, she's not a volunteer with this organization, and Johnny's the one that offered up the resource, and Johnny's the one that was offsides here, if you want to continue to talk football and fouls and throwing flags. So Johnny was offsides, but Susie, if she were a real astute nonprofit ambassador or leader or volunteer, she could have said, you know, I think that it's best if I talk to the CEO, because they would, you know, he would have the information, and he would be the decision maker there. And then tactfully reinforce that the new organizational chart, where the board is the governing body and the CEO is in charge of the day-to-day. So when a flag is thrown, excuse me, I need to get some water. Okay, so Johnny offered up a resource that he had no right or authority to do. So he's offsides. Someone called timeout. Flag is thrown. Penalty. It happened. And it happens all the time. As I said, expect and anticipate these types of growing pains. So first thing I always try to do when it happens to me is to presume a positive intent. Remember that you're on the same team and that this person is not trying to cause chaos, but is actually they just forgot their role for a minute, or they were just so excited they promised something they shouldn't have, whatever the case may be. So I always try to presume positive intent. And if I'm not sure about, you know, was this really a throw the flag situation, or was this just a gray area? I'm not sure. And, you know, a lot of times as CEOs, we need to pick our battles. So it's like, do I say something or don't I? Well, then I ask myself the 10 years question. You know, you think about, in 10 years, will this really matter? So I think, okay, is this even a 3 to 5 year? Is this a cultural shaping situation? Is this a situation that is really will make a difference to the organization in 10 years? You know, how big of an issue is it? Has this person continually offered the conference room, even though the board chair has talked to Johnny and said, Johnny, you can't do that anymore. We're not operating that way anymore. And Johnny just keeps doing it. Or was this the first, quote unquote, first offense? So kind of stop before you do anything, just kind of stop, presume positive intent, breathe, ask yourself, how big of an issue is it really? And make sure you're being mindful of, if I'm the CEO, was my ego hurt because they didn't ask me? Or is this really, you know, something that needs to be addressed? And kind of go from there. And be patient. Be patient with yourself and be patient with others. Because again, an organization is made up of people, of living things that are constantly changing. And, you know, fouls happen. So you want to develop a system to address those fouls. You want to create an organizational equivalent to throwing the flag. And even if you want to call it throwing the flag, or okay, you want to use the 3 hats, you know, you're stepping out of the hat that you're supposed to be wearing, or you're not in your swim lane, or whatever you want to do as an organization, but kind of create it and own it as your organizational culture, that you recognize people misstep, they go beyond what their roles are, or maybe they aren't doing the role that they're supposed to be doing, or there's confusion with a volunteer on who they report to. So own it. That is going to happen. So how are you going to reconcile? Think about how, not who, but how did the foul happen? What happened that led to this incident? And then how are you going to move forward? And then how can we prevent this in the future? And just having open dialogue can go a long ways, and do it sooner rather than later. Do it as soon after the infraction as reasonable, assuming that you are calm and that emotions aren't at play, and that everyone that needs to be involved in the conversation can be objective and really think about things and speak calmly about the issue, to look at it from a brainstorming and improving your organization's culture and processes, rather than blaming or voicing your frustrations in an unproductive way. So, as I mentioned, you started with this, then you transitioned to this, and remember, organizations are always changing. Now you're here. You've expanded to the point that you have 2 different programs, so you hired program managers for each of those, and then to help keep it all straight, you also hired an office manager that not only helps run the office, but also works with donors and coordinates things with customers, and just really the back engine, I guess you could say, of the organization to help everything run smoothly. So, and you still have volunteers. So you have added an additional layer of complexity. Now you really need to communicate who does what, when, where, and how. And don't expect that once you have this policy, okay, here's our policy, here's our employee manual, and Mr. Board Member, new board member, here's your orientation manual, and so you should all know what you're doing, and we're good to go. Because things are always changing, questions always come up, new opportunities may arise, whatnot, that will test these policies, these procedures. And while we would love for an org chart to look like this and everyone stay in their lane and it's nice and linear and peaceful and coherent, let's be real. Like I said, we're dealing with people. It gets mixed up. Our org chart sometimes looks more like a tie-dyed t-shirt. And so you need to make sure you communicate and know how to work around that. And so again, you want to look at, again, recognize that now not only the board needs to transition in their thinking around between the board and CEO, but the CEO needs to transition his or her thinking to, okay, I also have staff, so now how do I utilize staff and those volunteers, and when should a volunteer come to me versus when should a volunteer come to that staff person, and think through those things so that you and the staff person are on the same page, and that the volunteer knows who to go to, and hopefully you reduce some of the chaos. And as a board, so many times it feels like, oh, board members can't talk to staff. That's taboo. Now, one caveat is if it's in your bylaws, or if you're an organization that for some reason your bylaws or funder regulations and requirements say board cannot interact with staff, then it's not taboo. It's okay for board to interact with staff. But again, it's knowing what role you're interacting with. And so having board and staff, allowing board and staff to have relationships, and I mean like collegially relationships. We live in a small town. We're in a rural area. People are going to know each other. And I have board members that are really great friends of my staff. And so it can get a little uncomfortable, I guess, if you will, if I really stop and think about it. But I don't let myself go there, because we all know that, okay, this is appropriate communication to have. But when my employee is with her friends, that friend is not, a board member. They don't quote unquote talk shop. That their friendship is different, and it's not about grow and lead. So you can have a relationship, and it actually increases organizational transparency. And our board and staff, they work together quite often. In fact, just yesterday, we had a board member that treated our team of 6 to lunch, just to say, you guys are doing a great job, and I appreciate you. And wow, we are still talking about it today, how fun that was for all of us to be together and have lunch, and also for all of us to get to chat with that board member. So I use examples from Grow and Lead because they're fresh in my mind, not because we're the gold standard. So please understand that is not what I'm trying to say, and I don't expect board members to treat staff to lunches or anything like that. I'm just giving an example of how it can, allowing board members and staff to interact can build relationships. And it can also improve board members' experiences. My board member that treated us to lunch, she also really enjoyed that time. And she enjoys getting to talk to the whole team because she likes everyone. And we're a good team. I get complimented a lot on my staff. And so if I were to have told this board member, no, you don't need to buy us lunch. I don't want you interacting with staff. It's like, what kind of message would that communicate to my board member? So all staff can help improve board members' experiences by helping them better understand the organization, by helping them with meeting logistics, especially newer board members. And really, board members interacting with staff, it allows the board members to really see and get a feel for the personality and the culture of the organization. When I'm on a board, I always try to visit the organization at their office anytime I can, because you get a feel for how things are going. You know how you can just step in a room and you can know if there's tension or if things are going well? That's kind of a litmus test. And as a board member, that's one way to kind of check and see, how are things going? Just get a feel for it. Board members also, they can hear directly from the source, so to speak. Your people that are out providing the direct services, they're kind of your industry experts or your resident experts. And so they can provide presentations or training on some of the programs or issues that they're tackling. They can also talk about, from their standpoint, how things are going. And staff can support the work of committees. At Grow and Lead, we have advisory committees. We call them task forces, and we have both board and staff and volunteers on those task forces. And that's a way that board and staff interact with a common purpose, and it's understood in those task force meetings. It's understood that we're all equal, that board, volunteer, staff, there are no titles in the task force. We're all equal. We all have input. We all have say, and we work together as a team, I guess you could say. Staff can also help, like I mentioned, they can help manage meeting logistics. They can help board members make sure they have their materials, some of the clerical things that they can do. I even had our director of operations just today email a board member the expense reimbursement form because he travels to our board meetings. And what was nice is that she copied me on that. And she didn't have to necessarily. I mean, it's not like I have to see every communication between staff and board, but I appreciate that she did that, because then I know, oh, she sent that to Rod. That's good. Okay. at the next meeting, I can ask Rod if he has any questions or whatever the case may be. So it's just a nice communication standpoint. But I was also very appreciative that she went ahead and sent that to him without, having to have me sign off on something, I guess you could say, before she sent it. Some of the time when many times I should say, when I have a staff person that has a reason to email the whole board, they will ask me, do you want me to send it or do you want to send it? And so to me, that's, nice open communication, because, and I don't really have a hardcore policy on when I want to send it versus when I want them to send it. Kind of depends on if I have other things to say to the board, or what the topic is, or how busy I am. So I appreciate that every time she asks, because she knows I'm anything if I'm not consistent, that's for sure. Talked about managing meeting logistics, and yeah, build relationships. It really helps reinforce the all on the same team camaraderie. It helps board members be better ambassadors because they have more touch with the organization. They know the organization better, so they can speak about it at a deeper level to people, and the passion can really come through if you allow board and staff to interact. But if you do allow board and staff to interact, there are things that you really need to have in place to help reduce what I'm calling the fouls risk, reduce the risks of their people stepping out of their lane, or there being confusion about who does what. And so one is educate the staff and board members, obviously, but educate the staff and volunteers on the 3 hats of board members. That when board members are, as a group, as a unit, practicing their governance duties, the board as a unit, they have the ultimate decision-making over the organization. They are, quote unquote, the owners of the corporation, that they're responsible for this nonprofit. They're responsible to the community, to funders, to the IRS. So your board is a governing unit. Now, each member of that unit is an individual and can wear the hat of implementation, like we talked about on committees, or the hat of a volunteer. For example, a board member can be on a fundraising committee. And so they may not even interact with the CEO, depending on how large the organization is. With that fundraising committee, it's like they report to the chair of the fundraising committee. And so if the fundraising committee chair is doing something that this board member does not like, the board member needs to address it with the chair and with the group, not go and tell the board that, this is happening and we've got to stop it, or go directly to the CEO and say, this just is not right. I'm a board member and I should have a say, and I know the organization and this just will not go over well. No, if the board member on the fundraising committee does that, then the board and the CEO both need to reinforce, have you talked to the fundraising chair? What did they say? How big of an issue is this? And kind of talk to the board member, talk them through it, and remind them that they're a volunteer just like everyone else is on the committee. And while you do super duper appreciate their loyalty and their extra willingness to serve on the board, that in this case, this isn't the board decision. And if anything, it may get escalated to a CEO decision, but that's where it would stop. Of course, I'm assuming everything's legal and on the up and up when I give these examples. So educate about the 3 hats. And again, at Growing Lead, we have a slide that talks about the 3 hats, and we also do short little webinars or trainings on, okay, these are the 3 hats for board members. It's a great initial framework to help board members think about, especially if you're a board that's transitioning to a paid staff, or you have done that and you're still feeling the tension. then bringing up the 3 hats can help and be like, what hat do you have on right now? You know, and is that the right hat to have on? And something like that. Clarify that the CEO is the final authority when board and staff work together on projects. And that's kind of the example that I just went through. This may seem weird, but staff should know why they are interacting with the board. So is it just informal? The board member happens to stop by the office and wanted to see me about something, and the CEO about something, so they then also just chat with whoever happens to be in the hallway that they run into? That's fine. Are you asking the staff person to give the board a presentation about your program or about something that's going on in the industry or new research or whatever the case may be? Is it an instance where you're asking the staff to take over clerical duties and, you know, can you send this email, or can you let this board member know where the meeting is, or can you make sure that copies of the board packets we have extra board packets available for the meeting if anyone happens to forget theirs, that type of clerical thing, versus participant. And participant is like with us in the task forces, staff and board are together and they know they're a participant. Whereas just this last board meeting, I had a staff person present something to the board, but they knew they're there as a presenter and an observer, and that's it. They're not a voting member. They're, you know, that type of thing. So helping talk through here's what I want you to do, either staff person or volunteer. As the CEO, this is what I want you to do, and this is during the board meeting or during the committee meeting or whatnot, and see if they have any questions or whatnot. Also make sure that you have a complaint, and whistleblower policies that are in place. Make sure you have a complaint procedure in place. Like if a miscommunication happens, if someone is offsides and there's a foul and you feel like a flag should be thrown, then okay, what does the policy say? What do you do first? And if that doesn't resolve it, what do you do second? And so forth. So make sure you have those policies and procedures in place, and that everyone, board, staff, CEO, volunteers, everyone knows that policy and procedure, that you have them in place, and either they have a copy of it or they know where to get a copy easily and confidentially. And also to back that up, that you have a whistleblower policy, that if someone does air a complaint, that it will not be held against them. And again, that's communicated to everyone. And I touched on this a little bit, but especially while you're in the beginning phases of a big transition, like hiring your first paid staff or adding additional staff, this is especially for staff and volunteers, ask that the communications be channeled, especially requests of staff or volunteers, be channeled through the CEO. And this isn't so much a control as it is a courtesy. And as a CEO, that's how you need to think of it, is one, as a courtesy, and a little bit as a control, because you're also trying to do your part to make sure you stay in your lane and help everyone else stay in their lanes, so that a flag isn't thrown and a foul is not called. So that the channel communications, it's not a hard rule, but it's just, like I said, it's nice to have. I have staff, if they email the board, they copy me on it, which is nice, because then I know, oh, they emailed the board member that question. Fine, you know, it's I don't know, it's just a courtesy for communication's sake that personally I appreciate. But again, there's no hard and fast rule. The key is, I'd say the rule is to create your rules that work for you meaning the collective organization, communicate those rules, abide by those rules, and reinforce the behavior to reinforce those rules. So that would be the only rule that I would have. Did you follow that? Oh, I hope so. These are some of the resources that I used. And again, we have a lot of resources at Grow and Lead, or we can tap into resources. And if you just want to call and bend my ear and vent, or say, I have this situation, I'm not sure if I should address it or how I should address it, and you just want a third party person to be able to provide an outsider perspective, yeah, feel free and contact us, myself or anyone at Grow and Lead. Where we would be more than willing to lend our advice. And again, it's not expertise. It's not the end all be all of nonprofit management, but it's our just our opinions based on a lot of research and access to resources, and the way that we operate as well, or try to operate as an organization. And so with that, we do have time for questions, so how about that? Feel free to ask questions. Chad's monitoring the chat box, so if you have a question, feel free to type it in your little chat area. Are there any questions, Chad?
No, so far there is no questions.
So I either completely baffled you, bored you, or you understood everything. So let's hope for the latter. And also, if you do have a question that you would like to raise, like I said, I think that's a perk to being on a live webinar, then we don't want to cut you off. So if you're in the process of typing a question, or if you want to ask a question, you can also raise your hand so that Chad can see that. Click the hand button so he can see that and know that, okay, a question is coming and we don't want to cut you off. In the meantime, and I know it's sometimes hard to listen and to type at the same time, but in the meantime, I would just like to say thank you for the work that you do and the volunteerism and the dedication that you have to your causes to help make our community great. And please fill out an evaluation survey. Even if you really thought this just was not what you expected, please let me know. And you don't have to tell me your name, but just let me know, this isn't what I thought it would be, and I was looking for more of X, Y, and Z. Try not to just say it sucked, because then we won't, or it was great, because then it's like, okay, well, can you help us out about why you think it's great, or why you thought I bombed? Because I can't improve if I don't have a little more detail. But again, that's fostering open communication, and you do not have to put your name or email address with that evaluation form.
Still no questions, Amy.
All right, well, we're giving people 11 minutes back of their evening. So I think with that, we can close the webinar.
Sounds great. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and hope to see you next week when we talk about strategic planning.
Thank you.